A very warm welcome to today's lecture. Today we will be speaking on the topic Accommodating Diversity in Plural Society, Issues of Multiculturalism and Toleration Part 2. This is Dr. Manisha Mirdha, and let's begin the topic. The first part of this topic has already been deliberated upon. Let's begin with the following. So just to gain a brief recap of what we spoke in the previous program, what we said was that in a pluralist society, no one group or characteristic totally dominates social organization, because all groups have to act as if they value and accept diversity. So in other words, pluralism guards against totalitarianism and tribalism, though not against tribes asserting their separate identities, but providing that they accept the equal value of other cultures. So this is what we have spoken of about pluralism, and the fact also remains that the majority of Commonwealth countries today are plural societies where different ethnic, racial, cultural, religious groups live peacefully together. And moreover, it has also to be realized that important benefits can be reaped from cultural diversity. Say for example, increased cross-cultural competencies can thrive in a multicultural society. There can be mental flexibility and tolerance in the populace. There can also be artistic blossoming of the people. There can be social and political innovations in such a society, and there can be economic growth also amongst other factors. So therefore, by all respect, this kind of a setup, which is pluralism, is beneficial for the social organization. However, this has also to be understood and accepted that the concept has important challenges, which could be discrimination or conflicts or even a feeling of alienation. So we will try to understand all of that. But as I had said, that before we go into the further deliberation and understanding of multiculturalism, it becomes important for us to understand what a multicultural society is. Because from an outsider's perspective, the two terms look similar, but there is a difference. So let us first of all try to understand the models for a multicultural society. Multicultural societies have existed for long and have usually taken one of the following forms that we will be speaking of today. The three forms being segregation, assimilation and integration. Let's begin with segregation. So what is a segregated multicultural society? In a segregated society, the different populations are kept separate or they stay apart, either geographically or by having very few relations, even though they may live in the same area. So there might be people of different cultures, origins in the state living together. However, they stay apart, they stay segregated from each other, which could be a geographical segregation or some other form of segregation. In extreme cases, for instance, in South Africa during the apartheid regime, certain groups did not have access to the same professions. They did not have access to similar civil rights or public services as the rest of the population. In such cases, there is usually one group, the one in power, that assumes a privileged and advantaged position. So a segregated multicultural society would be that where different kinds of people exist, but there is always a supremacy of one culture. That is the extreme form of segregation. Segregation can also be found in milder forms, where segregation also seems to be involved in other situations, though in a less radical and less institutionalized manner. People tend to choose to live separately. Their social networks consist mainly of people from their own cultures. They do not have much contact with the other cultures. Say for example, minorities would have their own groups, their own culture, and they would not mingle up with the majority cultures, or vice versa for that matter. They could find themselves choosing from a reduced number of professions that are mostly occupied by people from the same culture as themselves. So there is a very voluntary segregation also found in multicultural societies. And in such cases, there may not be any laws preventing people from moving to other areas. or choosing other jobs or becoming members of the greater society, but highly efficient boundaries nevertheless exist in people's mind. So there is no such explicit boundary demarcated by the laws of the land. However, the implicit boundaries are clearly defined in the minds of the people, which ensure a kind of a segregation in a multicultural society. This may be equally true for people who are part of the majority culture also, and who don't necessarily invite people in from the outside, and for people from minority cultures that don't feel welcome or don't even feel comfortable outside of the cultural group that they identify as their own. So this could be an understanding of what a segregated multicultural society is, both the stronger kind of a segregation and the milder form of a segregation. Then another kind of multicultural society which is there is assimilation. Assimilation means that people from minority cultures adopt the majority culture. Now this is different from segregation. There the boundaries were either implicitly or explicitly defined. In assimilation, the majority culture may adopt certain elements from the minority culture. It is, say for example, their food preferences or their vocabulary or their beliefs, somehow making them a part of the unified whole. So therefore, one culture engulfs the other culture into its own nature. The assimilation model has traditionally been influential, at least it was influential up till 1960s and 70s, when the intellectual landscape changed radically under the influence of countercultures and liberal political philosophies. There have been successive waves of immigrants who were absorbed and became part of the new country. And to a large extent they were welcome, but they were expected to conform to the native way of life. Sometimes part of their original cultures became part of the common culture. So there have been multicultural societies which have thrived on this assimilation also. The melting point is a common metaphor for the assimilation model. This is a phrase, this is a metaphor rather, which, as I said, melting point, which explains assimilation quite clearly. It is the kind of a imagery which has its origin in containers used for heating up and mixing different metals with a new metal as the result. So the metaphor melting point is trying to create that kind of a imagery where different kinds of metals, here for that example, are put together and a new metal is created. Similarly, a new culture is created by assimilating different kinds of cultures. Some find it more useful to compare it to compare American culture to a pizza. In fact, the crust, they say, is a set of values shared by all Americans, whereas the toppings represent the diversity of various cultures. So therefore, this again becomes a metaphor of diversity based on core values. So you could say that, in other words, there are cultures which, if we take the example of America, they are unified as Americans but are still diverse with their own originality. Critics have claimed that assimilation as a model may lead to cultural minorities feeling discriminated against as a result of what may be seen as a lack of tolerance and respect. Moreover, one may wonder whether a society based on strict assimilation does not risk experiencing cultural stagnation if it does not conserve a certain openness towards contribution from other cultures. So what this is trying to say is that when everything has to boil down to one common frame, does it not lead to a very stagnating point? This could lead to a kind of a deterioration of cultures also. However, there have been others who have claimed that cultural homogeneity and a strong national identity contribute to national and social harmony with everything else this entails. So the other perspective which supports homogeneity says that when you have a cultural homogeneity, that can contribute towards a strong spirit of nationality also. The third model for multicultural society is integration. The integration model is sometimes simply referred to as multiculturalism. In this model, cultural minorities are allowed and to some extent expected and encouraged to keep their distinctive traits. This third type of multicultural society, which we are calling integration, is something which comes closest to our idea of multiculturalism. In this kind of a model, all kinds of minorities are allowed to keep their own distinctive traits, which could be values, their worldwide views, their tastes, preferences, lifestyles, etc., as long as they adapt to a common and more or less minimal framework of norms and values that guarantee a well-functioning society. So, as long as there is a common binding fact which puts all of these multicultural aspects together, they thrive and encourage diversity. So, in other words, you could say that integration as a model for multicultural societies generates respect for cultural differences. So, there will be respect for human dignity, there will be observance of human rights, tolerance, etc. Just as the melting pot was a metaphor used to explain assimilation, the metaphor used to explain integration is called a salad bowl. A salad bowl is often used as a metaphor for an integrated society. And like a salad, society is composed of a large variety of elements that are all the more delicious because they keep their distinctive qualities. In some countries, the phrase cultural mosaic is often used, which means a whole composed of distinct parts. The drawback is that in an integrated society, people from a majority culture sometimes experience a feeling of alienation, as if they were foreigners in their own country. So, it is not that everything is all rosy about this model of integration. There is a drawback here also, because here the chances of people feeling alienated, especially when they belong to the same country but feel like foreigners in their own country, is a challenge. However, considering that it is highly unlikely that cultural diversity will disappear anytime soon, the most potent criticism towards the integration model seems to be that it may be too easily developed into some sort of spontaneous segregation, where different communities living side by side without communicating in any productive manner at all. So, the flaw of this heterogeneous society, which is promoted by the model of integration, has this challenge where it could lead to a setup, or it could lead to a political system where people of different origins or diversities would exist side by side, but there would be lack of communication, which would be very unproductive for all of them. And this could also lead to tensions, because if cultures do not communicate, they cease to understand, they cease to exist, and that could be the end of all of the cultures, let alone give each other anything of value. So, these are three kinds of multicultural societies which can be there, as we spoke of segregation, assimilation and integration. And we also said that integration is something which comes closest to the idea of multiculturalism. It is something which eventually leads to multiculturalism. So, now let us try to understand the types of multiculturalism which are there. There have been various scholars who have spoken on types of multiculturalism. We will be talking about a typology given by Ayelet Shachar, who has first of all talked about two types of multiculturalism. Ayelet Shachar, as I say, is a professor of law of political science, and he says that multiculturalism can be of two kinds, strong and weak. Strong multiculturalism is centered on group identity and group rights, and it gives rights to the group over its members. The central problem for strong multiculturalists is injustice among different groups. So, therefore, this kind of multiculturalism, which we are calling strong multiculturalism, is a intergroup problem, whereas weak multiculturalism focuses on intra-group complexities and accommodation. The main focus is is on how to harmonize individual rights and group rights. Another scholar of political science, which is Andrew Haywood, says that there are three models of multiculturalism, which is liberal, pluralist and cosmopolitan. So, let us have a look at these three models of multiculturalism. The first one that we are going to be speaking on is liberal multiculturalism. Commitment to freedom and toleration are two hallmarks of liberalism. Toleration is a willingness to allow existence and expression of rival views. Liberalism gives an individual the right to choose his or her beliefs or cultural practices and the way of life. So, toleration extends to values, views and social practices that are compatible with autonomy and personal freedom. Say for example, practices such as forced marriages would not be endorsed by liberal multiculturalists, as they are against individual freedom. So, liberal multiculturalists are committed towards toleration and liberalism. In fact, Will Kimlicka's theory on liberal multiculturalism is one of the very important ones, as it combines the concept of liberal values of equality and autonomy with the values of cultural membership. His views can be found in his book Liberalism, Community and Culture, and also Multicultural Citizenship. And what he says is that culture is important to individuals for two reasons. First, membership of a culture is an important condition of personal autonomy, as they serve as contexts of choice and provide meaningful options by which an individual frames his life and goals. So, he has emphasized on the importance of culture, and he strongly believes that culture is what gives you that context, the context of choice, and therefore providing you meaningful options by which you eventually figure out your life goals. Also, and secondly, what he says is that cultural membership is important in shaping self-identity of an individual. So, one aspect what he spoke of was the context of choice. The second one he says is in shaping self-identity. A person's self-respect is definitely connected to respect that is accorded to him or her by the culture. Further, he argues that since cultural minorities are disadvantaged in accessing their own culture compared to the other majority cultures, minorities are entitled to special rights. And he also says that it is impossible for the state to be completely neutral in its involvement in the cultural character of the state. That is kind of unavoidable. Say for example, the public holidays that a government decides to observe would somehow promote a certain culture, and those who do not share the culture promoted by the state would be disadvantaged. So, therefore, true equality according to him requires different treatment for different groups. So, we come back to the points that we have discussed previously, that eventually a kind of a positive discrimination is something which becomes the duty of a state in a multicultural society. That was liberal multiculturalism, and now we move to pluralist multiculturalism. Now, this theory of cultural diversity is based on value pluralism, an idea that there are many values which are equally correct and fundamental, although they may be in contradiction to each other. Berlin is one of the main proponents of this idea of value pluralism. So, this view would say that there can be liberal views like personal freedom and democracy that have no greater moral authority than their rival beliefs. In a way, it is trying to say that the general perception that democracy is the only moral authority which a state can endorse is something which is not right. There can be different kind of views upheld in the society at the same time. There can be authoritarian rules, there can be despotic rules, there can be democracies all thriving together. This results in a kind of a scenario which they say live and let live, that kind of multiculturalism. However, Berlin was of the view that value pluralism can exist only within a society that respects individual freedom. Hence, he could not prove how liberal and illiberal cultures could coexist in the same society. So what he's trying to say in this concept is that there can be different kinds of completely opposing kinds of cultures existing peacefully together in the same setup. But he fails to explain that how would that be possible? How can such contradicting cultures thrive and coexist in the same society? So therefore, we come to the third kind of multiculturalism, which is cosmopolitan multiculturalism. This is something which is the final sense of multiculturalism. It celebrates diversity as each culture can learn from the other, and prospects for self-development are offered by a world of wider cultural opportunities and lifestyle choices. Cosmopolitan endorses exploration of different options from an individual's perspective. This kind of multiculturalism embraces the idea of multiple identity and hybridity. It is argued that irrespective of their different cultural origins, people share the same planet and are facing similar experiences and challenges. Hence, global consciousness and the idea of cosmopolitanism is a running thread in this type of multiculturalism. According to this, the common thread which binds human beings together is the very fact that they are born similar on this planet and largely face similar problems, and that is the major binding thread between humanity. So these were the three kinds of multiculturalism: liberal, plural and cosmopolitan. And as we have gone through the understandings of multiculturalism, we have also understood that there have been two major differences, or what you could say two waves of writings on multiculturalism. The first wave discusses differences amongst various cultural groups, and the debate is centered on relevance of difference in sensitive policies in a liberal context. So some liberals have defended these policies, while others have argued that they deviate from the core values of liberalism because they undermine the notion of equal individual rights and equal treatments. So the first wave was about intra-group differences, and the second wave where the writers are not concerned about justice amongst various groups, but rather within the groups. They analyze the policies that protect minority cultural rights and their impact on group members. Multicultural policies may give leaders of minority cultures power for decision making and institutionalizing practices that persecute the internal minorities. After having spoken about multiculturalism, let us also look into some of the limitations of multiculturalism. If I just quote Brian Barry, who says that religious and cultural minorities should be ready to face the consequences of their practices and beliefs in the same way as members of majority cultures are held responsible for bearing the consequences of their beliefs. So this is also to be accepted by the minorities, that just as the majority people of the state have to fare and have to face the consequences of their indulgences, similarly it applies for the minorities also. Religion and culture do not affect whether someone has the opportunity, although they may impact one's desire to take any opportunity or not. So that is the difference. Some progressive theorists have also believed that multiculturalism fails to address the grievances of the disadvantaged sections of the society. This is also one perspective which says that the real problem of minorities is not lack of cultural recognition, but their lack of economic power and social status. So this perspective says that it is not that recognition is not granted to the minorities, rather the kind of economic power, the kind of social status which should be granted to them is something which is missing. So by focusing on cultural distinctiveness, multiculturalism divides the people who want social reform and reduction in poverty. So this in turn reduces support for welfare policies as the society is divided and forgets issues like poverty that could actually unite them. In fact, Amartya Sen has also spoken of multiculturalism, and he has pointed towards the limitation of multiculturalism in the sense that he says it is based on a very solitarist theory. He argues that multiculturalism leads to miniaturization of humanity as identity is associated with a single social group. He says it makes violence more likely as people identify with their own groups and sometimes fail to recognize the rights of other groups. So, conservative and nationalist thinkers believe that multicultural societies are internally divided, where violence and hostility are accepted facts of life. So, this is trying to say that this whole concept of live and let live is a farce. There will always be violence and hostility in a multicultural society where people belong to very different and diverse viewpoints. People who are generally drawn to others with whom they share their identity, and they would distrust someone who is different from them in some ways of life. So, therefore, nationalists would like to say that they would like to limit immigration and assimilate the minority cultures to strengthen national identity instead of particular identities. So, what they are trying to suggest is that the only way out for a multicultural society to thrive is assimilation, that you have to assimilate the minorities into the majority perspectives for nationalism to thrive. Limitation of culturalism is also endorsed by the feminists who argue that group differentiated rights are used by men to strengthen and perpetuate their power in a group, and women are marginalized in the environment. After having given you an idea of what multiculturalism stands for, let us look at the example of our own country, which is a good example of multiculturalism. We talk about diversity in India, and we all know that India is a plural society both in letter and spirit. It is rightly said, and it is characterized by unity and diversity. Our own country is a grand synthesis of cultures, different cultures, religions, languages, of people belonging to different castes and communities, and still it has upheld its unity and cohesiveness despite multiple foreign invasions. So, national unity and integrity have been maintained even through sharp economic and social inequalities have obstructed the emergence of an egalitarian society. And it is this synthesis which has made India a unique mosaic of cultures. The term diversity in our own country emphasizes differences rather than inequalities. It means collective differences which mark off one group of people from another, and these differences may be of any sort, biological, linguistic, etc., or of races, religions, cultures. Unity means integration. It is a social psychological condition, and when we say that India is a nation of great cultural diversity, what we mean is there are different kinds of social groups and communities living here. What is it that gives diversity to India? Various forms of diversity in India can be found in religious diversity, because India is a land of multiple religions, and apart from the tribal societies, many of whom who still live here belong to different kinds of religions. They are Muslims, they are Christians, they are Sikhs, they are Buddhists, Jains, etc. Apart from religious diversity, other forms of diversity found in India are linguistic diversity. There are various languages spoken in India. There is racial diversity. There is caste diversity. In fact, the term caste has been used to explain both Varna and the Jati system. Varna, as we all know, is a fourfold division of society according to functional differentiation, and the four Varnas of our society are Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas and Shudras. And Jatis refer to a hereditary status group practicing a specific traditional occupation, and they all coexist peacefully. There is cultural diversity because of population diversity. There is immense variety in Indian culture. There is geographical diversity. India is a vast country with great diversity of physical features. There are deserts and there are evergreen forests, there are lofty mountains, there are perennial and non-perennial river systems, etc. But what gives the unity to this diversity? Our own constitutional identity, our own religious coexistence, our interstate mobility, economic integration, all of this gives the unity to this diversity of India. There are fairs and festivals, there is sport and cinema, there is a kind of a developmental politics which ensures stability. However, there are other factors also which threaten India's unity. There are divisive politics, there are developmental imbalances, etc. Having said this, we will wrap up the discussion by saying that Constitution and its values form the guiding principle of any society. Any society which has tried to homogenize itself has witnessed stagnation in due course. So, therefore, cultural diversity continues to be a feature of many states around the world, and instead of seeking a melting point, let us stand for something which is close to a salad bowl, where the constituents retain their identity. I would like to finish off the presentation with the hope that it was helpful for you. Thank you so much.